Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Dauphinais. And today, we are joined by Sister Mary Elizabeth Merriam, a Dominican sister of the Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Great. So it's so great to have you on the show, Sister, and you're giving the annual Paula Castagnet lectures at Ave Maria University on faith and science. And so we're so glad to have you here on the show this year. And, it's really fascinating, right? So you're a religious sister.
Yes.
And you also have a PhD in electrical engineering, right? So you've really gone deep into both, right, very deep into kind of, right, faith, and yet also right deep into this scientific understanding of the world.
Yes.
Right. And so we just wanted to get a chance to talk today. And just to kind of begin, I think a lot of young people, sometimes you hear it like in school or high schools or colleges. And I know you teach now in a Catholic high school, right? St. Michael the Archangel in Missouri. And have also done a lot of work in colleges and universities. Right. A lot of people, I think, just have this vague sense that, science, modern science has somehow disproved Christianity. Modern science is in conflict with Christianity. Maybe this is through evolution, cosmology, right? How would you respond to somebody comes up to you and asks you that question?
It's not possible for them to be in conflict because God is the author of all that exists. Yeah. And so, we know truth can't contradict truth. So what authentic science discovers about the universe has to be in accord with what our faith teaches us.
Yes. It's actually, I think it was Einstein who said that, right, when we discover the very intelligibility of the universe, there must be a mind behind the universe. Because we don't see the world as, we see the world as intelligible, right? And so I just think that's a beautiful thing. Science itself is fundamentally, right, means the word to know.
Yes.
And so we're not simply manipulating things, we're coming to know and understand the underlying principles. And it's those underlying principles that in a way are almost kind of like the divine fingerprints, if you want to put it, on the universe, and right where their fingerprints, right, there's a crime, right? Or, there's a criminal. And in those fingerprints of the universe, so to speak, we see somehow, not all of God, obviously, but we do see a little bit of the mind of God as displayed in his creation.
Yes, we can see the beauty of creation,
yes.
The truth of creation. So we know, and as you said, the intelligibility, that there is understandable, and it's understandable to us humans.
Yeah.
There has to be a reason for that. We know that, God is the creator.
Right, yeah, and some of the science is based upon the idea that there is an underlying rationality to the universe that often exceeds our ability to understand it, which again also kind of points to the idea that whatever mind behind the universe must be bigger than ours.
Yes. Right? You can't do science without trusting that the universe is intelligible.
Wow, how beautifully put. So to continue, you're going to be one of your lectures that you'll be delivering as part of the series is on the Big Bang, right? Creation and God's action, and right, you tell a fascinating story about that right, the Big Bang was developed by a Catholic priest.
That's
He's also
right,
one of the great cosmologists of the 20th century, and right, and even before we talk a little bit more about that, I just think it's interesting. I remember hearing Steve Barr, who's written a fair amount on theology and science, who's a physicist, but he talked about, I think it's something like out of the 25 major in scientific discoveries of the last 400 years, I don't know, something like almost 20 were made by Catholics.
That's awesome.
But I don't know exactly, but just some of them. Louis Pasteur, right, is a devout Catholic who comes up with microbiology and vaccination. Andre Marie Ampère basically ends up developing the whole field of electromagnetics, also a devout Catholic. Gregor Mendel, a Benedictine monk, develops our whole understanding of genetics. Alois Alzheimer, interestingly, discovers, well, lo and behold, Alzheimer's dementia, right? Alzheimer's disease. You have Pascal, Martin Marseille, who is a mathematician who develops basically a whole new understanding of prime numbers. And even, I think sometimes when people think about, the church is against science because the church criticized Galileo, one thing that's interesting is that Copernicus, who was the one who came up with the understanding that the Earth rotated around, or that our solar system rotated around the sun and not the Earth, that was actually rejecting really fundamentally a Greek view of the universe, which of course the entire developed world had accepted until Copernicus, who was a Catholic, actually began to come up with that. And then Galileo himself, again, a Catholic, who who develops a deeper understanding of this idea. And yes, there were other churchmen who disagreed at times about what should be taught and how it should be taught. But fundamentally, these are all views of people that are kind of devoutly Catholic. And I remember even Galileo has this line where he says, the Bibles teach us how to get to heaven, not how the heavens go.
Yes.
And it's interesting, I noticed that later, and we can talk about this, that George Lemaitre actually also has a similar quote where he says something along the lines of, the Bible, he says, the church has always taught that the Bible teaches salvation. Not science.
That's right.
Right? That's not, in a certain sense, science is wonderful, but we don't need it to solve the existential pain in our hearts. Right? That is something only in a way God's mercy can solve. And that's the story of the Bible. Science is part of just the goodness of creation that we can begin to understand. So just thought it's kind of fun just to kind of put it a little bit in that context that, how do we, because again, if this is something that people almost like drink like water and it's in the air, one idea won't overcome it. So in a certain sense, the fact that devout Catholic soil turns out to be a great place, not only to do science, but to advance science. How wonderful. So maybe could you tell a little bit about how did you get interested in George Lemaitre and then a little bit of his story?
Sure. I love studying faith and science, and I'd heard about Father Lemaitre. I love studying Catholic scientists, and often have my students do poster projects on Catholic scientists.
Oh, yeah.
And so I just wanted to learn more about him, and the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn, and just realized he had a deep Thomistic understanding of how faith and science go together, and he could freely do science, understanding the way the world works, and realizing that glorifies God. To study his creation and to learn about it. And then at the same time, as you said, he was very devout. He was a priest. He celebrated daily mass.
Wow.
You think he had a daily holy hour or periods of prayer. He went to annual retreats. So he lived a full Catholic faith life and made major physics discoveries.
Wow. So can you tell us a little bit about what's his time frame? When was he born? When did he do his research? What were some of his major discoveries?
He was born in the late 1800s, and then he passed away in 1966. So that's the time frame he was living in. When he was about 10, I think Einstein had published his special theory of relativity. And then 10 years later, Einstein published the general relativity. And that kind of took space, time, matter, energy, and showed the way they're interconnected, which is fundamentally shifts our worldview. And we don't think about it on our daily basis, that how they all interact with each other. And Einstein and most scientists at that time thought we had a static universe, one that wasn't really changing. So Einstein actually fudged his equations a little. They added in what's called the cosmological constant to help make his equations match a static universe.
So what's just for listeners or viewers, what's a static universe?
So a universe it's not expanding, it's not contracting. It's kind of like the way it's always been. So if you observed it now, and if you observed it years from now or in the past, you'd kind of see the same sort of universe.
Okay.
You'd expect it to do the same sort of things. But several scientists looked at his equations and started pointing out, actually, the universe might be doing other things. It might be expanding. So one scientist came up with the fact that you could solve his equations and you could have, an empty universe. But that's not very practical. It's not. It doesn't really match reality.
Yeah.
So something that Father Lemaitre was able to do is to show how Einstein's equations actually work for our universe, and that our universe is expanding.
So in that way, he is kind of maybe like a second like the generation that's receiving Einstein's great discoveries.
Yes.
But great discoveries, are never total. They're never complete. They have to be received. And he's applies his. And now, is he a priest yet? Is he a physicist?
He went to college, then World War I happened.
Oh, wow.
So he actually served in World War I, and then he came back. So he started college, he started with engineering, and he went back into math and physics. So at that time, he was studying relativity when he was studying physics then. Once he finished that degree, he entered seminary. They had a special program because of the war for delayed vocations. He was able to complete seminary in 3 years.
Oh, okay.
And then he went on to get 2 PhD degrees. So he was very academic.
It's also interesting, too, that, that also just kind of shows something that, is that bishops or religious orders allow people who are totally dedicated to the church and to God.
Yes.
And to ministry to not all the time, but sometimes to seek these advanced degrees.
Yes. Yes. So he had the opportunity to study at Cambridge, and then he actually studied here in the U.S. He studied at Harvard Observatory, but since they weren't giving PhDs, he got the PhD through MIT.
Okay.
So
wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And then so this understanding, is that when he is able to kind of save Einstein's equations by adjusting them? Is that the moment in a way that he discovers what we call now the Big Bang theory?
So it kind of happened in 2 phases.
Okay.
So he went back to Belgium, to University of Louvain, and started teaching there. And then in 1927, he published in French his first major, what we consider now his first major work about how the universe is expanding and Einstein's equations. Not many people actually saw that article because it was in French in the Belgium art. And so Hubble, 2 years later, publishes basically the same thing. And that's why we know Hubble's law, which has recently renamed Hubble-Lemaitre law.
Oh, interesting.
So to acknowledge the fact that Lemaitre actually had published it first, and just people hadn't realized. So that was republished. Eddington, which was one of his research advisors, was able to get it republished in an English journal in 1931. And that same year, Father Lemaitre, he had been, thinking about this. Well, if the universe, if you went forward in time, is expanding, what if you thought about going backwards in time? It would be contracting. What if you went back far enough? Everything, all of the matter in the whole universe, all of space. When I say the universe is expanding, I don't just mean things are getting farther apart. Like you have an empty stage and the actors are moving away from each other. I mean, the whole universe is expanding. Space itself is expanding. The stage is expanding.
Yeah. So
if we went back in time, everything would be contracting. And so he was like, well, everything came back to an initial quanta or a few quantums, like a singularity. And it's so mind-boggling. It's hard for us to actually conceive. The scientific community actually wasn't sure if they should believe this when they first came up with it.
Yeah. I heard that, I don't know if maybe you could say more, but I heard that at first, they were suspicious because that sounded they thought that this scientific theory was just a way of trying to say what Genesis already said. When Genesis says God said, "Let there be light," and He created everything. And so at first, the Big Bang theory was actually was kind of somewhat not accepted because it sounded too Christian, too Catholic.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And it's interesting because actually Father Lemaitre was very clear this did not come from his Catholic beliefs and that this was a purely scientific understanding of the world. And he distinguishes, he said, this is a beginning, but it's not creation.
Oh,
but
wow.
There was particularly Fred Hoyle proposed an alternative model of a universe that this is called the steady state model, the universe not changing sizes. And in order to do this, he thought this was better than having a beginning. He said, well, the universe is expanding, but the density needs to be constant. And the only way for the density to be constant if space is expanding is new matter is actually just coming into existence. So this was a simplified version of Fred Hoyle's alternative theory to Father Lemaitre's because he didn't like the idea of having a beginning because it sounded too Christian.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then what was the scientific discovery that kind of shifted the scientific consensus back in favor of?
Yes. So they were able to realize, okay, if this really happened, if everything happened, there would be able to be like background radiation from the original event.
Mm-hmm.
And scientists were able to discover that background radiation to confirm Father Lemaitre's work.
Yeah. So that is kind of a neat, it's a neat little vindication of his work. And although we shouldn't we don't want to conflate theology and science, right? We shouldn't be afraid of following scientific discoveries,
right?
Even if they might sound to people as though they're, Christian. So, but you raise a very key distinction there, between the universe having a beginning and the universe being created. Could you say more about that distinction?
Yes. Let me give a little analogy first. So, one of the books I enjoy reading is The Lord of the Rings. And the beginning of the book starts with Bilbo, the hobbit, planning a birthday party. Well, that's the beginning of the book, but that doesn't explain the existence of the book. I need the author, Tolkien, to explain the existence of the book. Now, this analogy is limited, as all analogies, because once the book exists, it doesn't need Tolkien to keep existing. But with contingent beings, which we are, we don't have to be. We can be or not be. My parents didn't have to meet and get married, and I could not be here right now. We need a cause outside of ourselves for our ongoing existence. So a beginning in time is when something starts, but creation is actually the sustaining, the giving of being, and sustaining in being, the sustaining in existence of somebody.
Yeah, I think that example of the author is a very helpful one, because you can also see that. I think you can also extend that to the idea of the time of the author doesn't really fit within the time of the stories, right? It may have been years between when he writes the story, when he thinks and starts writing the story of the Bilbo of the birthday party. It might have been 4 years before he actually then wrote about the fireworks from Gandalf and the dragon coming in, right? Or something like that. And right, it's just because they're not at the different levels. But the question is, within the story, I say it has its logic, it has its inner meaning, and so it has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end, it has a purpose. The story is real. Then you have the author, though, that is clearly outside the story, bringing and thinking these ideas, and then, of course, as the author, and that's why Tolkien would describe writing as a myth making as sub-creation, because we create a story within God's larger creation. So, right, we still have to mimic the basic reality of the real creation. But I think that is a really powerful idea. So I know that when Aquinas would look at Aristotle's teaching on the idea that, well, when we see things in the world that are real, we see bunnies that cause other bunnies, we see trees that cause other trees, right? They have seeds, and then you get more trees. And where do things come from? They come from other things. And so, Aristotle thought the world was eternal, that had lasted forever like this, and still thought there needed to be a first cause, a primary cause that somehow held all these things in being. So, right, and Aquinas would then say, even when we see the natural world, we could even if the world were eternal, it would still need a creator.
That's right.
Because the world itself is still, in a way, secondary. So it turns out the world does have a beginning, which we believe from Scripture, Aquinas teaches. And, ironically now, science tends to hold a similar view at the beginning, but that's distinct from the idea that the creator is actually holding things in being, is right, that the being that we receive, the order we receive, is not an order that we generate. Right?
In a way, it's like we're continually receiving existence.
Yes.
It's not just I received existence when I began to be. It's I'm receiving existence at this moment now, which means God's that close to me right now. He's not some far distant God. He's with me now.
Yeah. So I think maybe when sometimes people think then about God as a creator, they sometimes think about this idea of like God as a watchmaker. If I see a watch, there must be a watchmaker. God wound up the universe and then he kind of sets back and he kind of gave us the universe. He gave us our intelligence. We should figure it out on our own. How would you describe that view of creation?
To me, that gives creation a self-sufficiency, but that's an illusion. Creation is not self-sufficient. And we are dependent, and we're continually dependent upon God. And I actually love this concept of dependence. Dependence in our world today is sometimes kind of like people don't want to be dependent. They want to be independent.
Yes.
But if you think about being dependent upon the one who loves you into being, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Like God is willing me into being right now. He's loving me, knowing me into being right now. And if he stopped thinking about me, I wouldn't die. I just would be annihilated. I just wouldn't exist. So I love the fact that I'm dependent upon God right now and that we don't have the watchmaker model, that God is involved in every single moment of my being and also every single act.
Yeah, that's so well put. I like the image that in a way we want to be independent, and maybe partly the reason why we want to be independent is because in a way people often let us down.
Yes.
Right? And so this beautiful sense that when we're dependent upon God, right? God is in a way the only one in a certain sense in whom we can completely trust because right he can't die, he exists eternally. He has he's all merciful, all powerful,
all good,
right? He's the one in a way who can completely hold us in, and in a way this is something, so we move there easily into a theological religious understanding of God who has spoken to us and revealed his mercy. But this is already in a way revealed philosophically through the understanding of creation, which is that right I don't exist on my own. I came from my parents. They came from their parents. They came from their parents, right? You can't go back to all sorts of contingent beings, as you put it. There has to be, a cause. And I think maybe one thing I remember hearing early on when I was studying faith and science is just this very simple idea, but that science can determine changes. Science is very good at looking at how things change from one state to the next. And that's really amazing. And it's incredible that not only are things happening randomly, but they're intelligible patterns and ordering that we can discover. But at the same time, creation is asking the question, right? Not how do things change, but why is there something rather than nothing? Right. Why is there anything at all?
Yes, definitely.
And that gets into then even on the natural level a certain sense of wonder, right, and awe.
Yeah.
So let's take a quick break, and when we get back, let's continue to discuss this understanding about how is it that then if God doesn't wind up the universe and just let it wind down, if God's constantly active, then how do we understand God's action kind of in relationship to ours?
Sounds good.
Great, thank you.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. If you'd like to support our mission, we invite you to prayerfully consider joining our Annunciation Circle, a monthly giving program aimed at supporting our staff, faculty, and Catholic faith formation. You can visit us at avemaria.edu to learn more. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
Welcome back to the Catholic Theology Show. Today, we are joined by Sister Mary Elizabeth Merriam, a member of the Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist from Ann Arbor, Florida. And we've been discussing faith and science, specifically the understanding of creation and the scientific theory of the Big Bang, and the Catholic priest, George Lemaitre, who really developed this and discovered it. And so been talking about that understanding. And so again, thanks so much for being on our show today.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Excellent. So we're trying to get, in a way, one of the difficulties, I think, is that like we understand changes. We understand how to take clay and make it into something else.
Yeah.
We can imagine it. We understand how to have a 3D printer and have it build something. We understand how to build a house. We're used to making things all the time. Creation is at the edge of making, right? It's the bringing into existence. We can't imagine it. It's at the edge of our ability to comprehend, right? We really have to just affirm that these things that have received being. They do not have perfect being. They've received their being from perfect God. And so I think it's so important to really remember that this is it's something more than the making of things that we are used to seeing, that we can kind of comprehend how did it happen. In a way, there is no how creation happened, right?
Yes, because change is a process.
Yes.
And I think that sometimes we take the ideas of change and we try to apply them to creation.
Yes.
Change takes time.
Mm-hmm.
So you take the clay and you have to push it and you have to pull it and you mold it. But creation doesn't take time. Creation's not a process. And God created ex nihilo, out of nothing. He didn't start with, and nothing's not something pre-existing. And I really mean nothing, not just no matter, but no energy fields, no space, he created us on nothing. And the creation isn't just bringing into being, but that ongoing holding in existence.
Yeah, right. Which is why we can continue to have changes now.
Yes.
That are real. That I'm really contributing, doing something, and yet at the same time, God is also at the same time creating and holding and being, because these are non-competitive. So, it's wonderful as a Dominican and as a great student of St. Thomas, as you are, and I'm a big fan of St. Thomas's theology, as is the Church. That in a way, his philosophical understandings of creation help us kind of how would you say that this allows us? Why is it Aquinas' understanding is particularly helpful for understanding in a way God's relation to the world, in a way that that there's some other ways of thinking about it that might get us into kind of trouble?
Yes. I think when Aquinas thinks about God acting in the world, he really means God acts in the world and all the time. And we talked about the watchmaker model of God before, where God kind of sets up the world and gives it the push start, and then the world's on its own. And that's not Aquinas' view. But another view that's also not Aquinas' view is almost the opposite. It's occasionalism. In this view, it looks like the creature does something, but really God's doing it all. So if you strike a match, you're actually not causing activation energy to be achieved, or the friction isn't really doing anything. God just happens to cause the fire when you strike the match. Here, that would be God doing everything, and the creature actually not being a cause at all.
Yeah.
So the Thomistic perspective is it's both and. So much of our Catholic faith. God works in and through us, but we can be real causes. God gives us our being, but he also gives us our nature and our ability to act. And in all of our acts, he is working so that we can act.
Yeah, so I think it's in Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, in the early parts of the Summa. Anyway, he has this beautiful line where he talks about God gives to his creatures the dignity of causality.
Yes.
C.S. Lewis has a wonderful way of putting this in Mere Christianity, where he simply says, this is not a toy world.
No,
it's not a toy. It's a real world. And so our actions have real consequences.
Yes.
When we do something, it really gets done. And if we don't do something, it really doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right? If an earthquake happens, it really happens. All these things, both things happening well, and then also somewhat happening not well. When things fall apart. Right? All of these things are happening properly in a way because of the created order.
Yes.
That is, sometimes houses fall apart because they were built poorly. Sometimes they're built poorly because people were confused. Other times they were built poorly because people took bribes, right? Those things happen. God's not actively making those things happen as though he's pulling strings, as though it's a puppet. And yet at the same time, God is somehow holding in being, right, all of creation so that, right, that this action that we see in the world is both kind of the expression of God's goodness and his action and order, and at the same time also part of the, right, bunnies cause bunnies.
That's right.
Right.
That's
God
right.
is also holding the bunnies in being, but
That's
it's also
right.
true that the reason why you have little bunnies is because you have a mom and a papa bunny, at least for a moment, or a little. I don't know if they raised probably their litters together or something, but you know what I mean. But it's like, but this idea that it's 100% the bunny and 100% God.
That's a very important way to put it. And I think two words or two terms can be helpful here: primary and secondary causality. So it's both God and the creature. God as primary cause and the creature as secondary cause. And we can see this in the world. Like, I'll ask my students, like, what do saws do? And they're like, look at me like, cut wood? I was like, yeah, saws cut wood. But they cut wood because you hold it and you move it back and forth on the wood. So you're the primary cause of the wood being cut, and the saw is the secondary cause of the wood being cut. Similarly, when if a child scribbles with a crayon, the crayon makes marks, but the child is also making marks. So it's both the child and the crayon having that action come to be.
Yeah. So in a way, God, as you're putting it here, as you're describing it through the primary and secondary causality, it means the world as we understand it is a world of secondary causes.
Yes.
Is that is that a helpful way of putting it?
So science can study secondary causes. Science can study the change that we cause, and again, it's studying change. Science studies change.
Yeah. Okay, so science in a way is investigating secondary causes, and all of these causes are at the same time, because they're totally real.
They are real.
Right? And at the same time, they also kind of give witness to, on a philosophical or theological level, primary cause.
The primary cause is God.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think one of the difficulties, and I don't know, how would you respond to this, is I think sometimes when people think of like a first cause, maybe they'll describe it, or the primary cause, we immediately want to imagine it as the first in time, the first in sequence,
That's
the
more like-
beginning, as you put it. How do we try to think about the primary as constantly always acting?
I think the model you're describing is the domino model.
Yeah.
So someone sets up the dominoes and gives the first push.
Yeah.
And that doesn't account for why the dominoes are still in existence.
Mm-hmm.
What's holding the dominoes in being? So God's the one that holds us in being right now and gives us our natures and gives us our ability to act right now.
Yeah, maybe it's like in some ways, if you're thinking about two models of how this could work, I was thinking about maybe, you could have like two people rowing in a boat, right? That's the idea of, well, two people who are rowing in a boat, they're both contributing 50%.
Yes.
Right? And so they're in a way side by side. They're in a way in competition with one another. Doesn't have to be negative, right? But if one is stronger, maybe they should row more.
Yeah.
Right? And these sorts of things, right? And but I was also thinking about maybe another image would be something like the idea of if a flower is growing, the flower is genuinely growing on the flower's own.
Yes.
But the flower can also only grow because the sun is illuminating it. Right? Without the sun,
the flower's not going to grow.
Flower's not going to grow. So, but the flower is genuinely growing. And so it's not, again, these are still it's within creaturely, but there's something like that, so that the flower becomes more properly the flower when the sun illuminates it and when it has water. So creatures become more properly themselves the more they can turn, to the extent they can, to God.
To God. I think another image that can help us understand like how we need God to hold us in being is one Frank Sheed uses of a mirror. So you can stand in front of a mirror and your image doesn't appear in the mirror until you stand there. But as soon as you leave, your image goes away. The image isn't self-sufficient. It can't stay there on its own. You can't even just give it a push start to get it started and have it stay. You have to continually be there for the image to continually stay. So it's kind of like that with God in the world. We need God's continual presence in the world, acting in the world.
And there's a beautiful psalm, Psalm 19, and I want to just quote it, or make sure that I get the quote right. But it just has this beautiful idea: the heavens are telling the glory of God, the firmament proclaims his handiwork. right? The heavens, the stars. It's interesting. This is right 3,000 years ago, or something that this is being written, and yet still today we find the stars fascinating.
We do.
We love to see, and the more we learn about the stars, we find them even more fascinating. We realize they're like, they have star nurseries where they're born and then they grow up and they become, and then they eventually die. We realize they have life cycles. How wonderful. And then that only makes them even more
fascinating,
glorious. And so, right, this basic idea that day on today pours forth speech, night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out to all the earth. So there's this idea that the stars, and it's interesting, by the way, remember, if we think about the ancient world, well, the ancient world was often thought that the stars and the planets were gods. Right. They were semi-divine. They had power and authority. They should be worshipped. The sun and the moon were often worshipped.
Yes.
That's why in Genesis, they're just called the bigger light and the lesser light. They don't even get names because God's the only God, right? So in a way, here what we're saying is, no, the created world is not a God.
Yes.
The created world, in a way, it doesn't speak, but it does. When you see the created order, you're kind of hearing the speech of God.
Of the creator. When you look at a painting, you see something about the artist.
Yeah.
When you look at creation, you see something about the divine artist.
Yeah, and then if you go back to Genesis, what does Genesis say? It's God speaks creation into beings. But we sometimes think that happened in the past, but it's more that in creation we hear God's voice. And then when you get to, say, John, in the beginning was the Word, right? In the beginning, quoting Genesis, but in the beginning was the Word, the very speech, the Logos, the Word of God, through whom God created the world, was with God, in God, and everything that was made
through him.
So this idea, in a way, of trying to see the world as not idolatrous, which is very dangerous, as though it's divine, that would be, because it just turns out planets are fun and they're great to look at, but they can't save us. They can't forgive our sins, and they can't save us. So we need to discover they are only icons. They are only images, as you put it, right? They're not God.
Right.
And that's very important. But I think in a way today, maybe people might be, although who knows, there are a lot of people actually who, follow astrology a lot and who might want to kind of see the planets as gods. And I don't remember who it was, but somebody said, like, once people stop believing in creedal faith, they'll believe in anything almost, But there's also a deep sense in which kind of people who want to see the universe as all there is. Yes. It's kind of almost it's not a worship, but it's kind of like a soft idolatry, because what you're saying is the highest thing is not God. It's not even my logos, my intellect.
No.
It's not human love. The highest thing there is kind of dirt following cosmic dirt following cosmic principles.
Yes, it doesn't matter.
And in a way, that is like, that's kind of like the same thing. So it's thinking that's all there is, rather than saying it is wonderful.
Yes.
Right. And what a beautiful thing that people dedicate their lives to studying it.
Science is worth studying, and God made it, and He made it good, and it's a joy to be able to study.
Absolutely, but in that sense in which it's speaking for it. So I think it's just a helpful way of again, God didn't just speak creation into being at the beginning, but He continues to speak it. And if we listen to creation, we can kind of almost hear His word. This is the weird sense in which Aquinas, maybe you could talk a little bit about this. Aquinas is not a pantheist at all. But on the other hand, if you read Aquinas a little bit, you could almost think he's a pantheist. Would you just say a word about that?
I think I want to go back to what you were talking about, the models of like how Christianity and the Judeo-Christian heritage have helped us to say that, okay, the sun's not a god, the moon's not a god. And we have to be careful that we don't try to put God into the world as a force acting among the world. Because so often that's our tendency when we're thinking about science and faith is, well, where's God acting in the world? Is He acting in the electron spin? Is He acting in chance? Is He acting in... And it's like, that's making God another force within the world and kind of lowering Him to the level of a creature. and just something else that's, like you said, a puppet,
Yeah.
a puppeteer pushing and pulling strings. But God transcends the world. So he's outside of the world and holding it into being. So I think that that's an important distinction.
Yeah. And so because he's so transcendent, he can also then be so immanent.
Yes.
So he's present in the very being of the creature.
Right. So like we can be next to each other.
Yes.
And that's as close as creatures can get. But God can work in my very nature.
Yes.
So that's way closer. And he can only do that because he's transcendent.
Yeah, yeah. And that's where Aquinas will say that God's existence is in things, right?
Yes.
The very being we have, the shape that we have, the form, the nature we have is actually not our own, right? It's kind of obvious in a way that if you look at a building doesn't have its own kind of architectural plan. It receives that plan from the architect. So the very nature that I have is something that I receive from God in a way is actively being thought. So God is intimately present to me, not only in my being, but in a way in the kind of being that I have.
Yes.
Right. And so in a certain sense, each created thing, we can say, yes, that is not God. But on the other hand, God is in that thing being the kind of thing it is.
Yes.
Right. And whether or not this is so, God is not, the bird is genuinely flying, right? God is not, so to speak, holding the bird in there. And yet, on the other hand, there's also a certain sense in which God is present in the bird's ability to fly.
Yes. Which is, I mean, it's just fascinating and amazing. This goes to the four causes and of Aristotle, which St. Thomas took, and the material cause. God is not our material cause because God's pure spirit.
Yes.
And he makes everything out of nothing. But there's formal cause, efficient cause, final cause. And we've talked about efficient cause already when we talk about primary and secondary causality and how we can act because God's acting in and through us. And then you were just bringing up formal cause. God is our exemplar cause. We imitate him. He gives us the ability to be causes. So we are actually that's a gift, a participation in his causality through that. And then he's the final cause. He's our goal, our purpose, our all. And especially for all of creation, but especially for us rational creatures, he wants us to come, to be in communion with him. And that's really the ultimate of all of this.
Yeah. So, now, Lemaitre, by the way, speaks a little bit about this, doesn't he? He says the idea that, yes, there's a Big Bang, there's a cosmic explosion that is our very universe, but he also says that view is compatible with the idea that God organizes or somehow is the principle of all that, and yet, right? I mean, because I think some people, once they start thinking about 14 billion years old, hundreds of billions of galaxies, I think it was Carl Sagan who used to talk about billions and billions of stars and billions of galaxies as though somehow, like he had also discovered the insignificance of humanity, right? Which, of course, it's funny. It's right all in the Psalms. Everyone's already figured out that we're pretty insignificant. And I think it's Psalm 8, right, that says, right, what is, when I look at the heavens and this moon and the stars, right, what is man that you are mindful of him, right? And yet you have made him, that yet you are. So how does, Father Lemaitre, right, this brilliant physicist, show that this understanding in a way of the cosmic history
I think what
is somehow connected to us?
I think what you just brought up actually made me think of the incarnation. And Father Lemaitre mentions, about that and how God does take care of us, and so much that God became man. That's how much he loves us. He wants us to know who he is, and he's going to come up with a way for us to be able to understand who he is.
Yeah, and it's in a way, all of creation speaks God, right? And therefore, you want to put in the garden, God, we in the garden, we would have been able to hear God in creation, but because of sin, creation becomes dark. Our hearts become dark. We no longer speak. We no longer have ears to hear or eyes to see. So what does Jesus do in a lot of his healings? He gives people sight and hearing. He lets us speak, right? And so he has to kind of recover us in this understanding so that now, right, in the incarnation, God does what we need through sin is we rediscover this communion with God. And one theme that I love, and the Catechism talks about this in paragraph 302, and I at least when I've taught this theme, I've found it very helpful, is that it says that God did not create the world perfect. He did not create it complete. He
Not
created
complete.
it in a state of journeying, in statu viae, in a state of journeying. Could you explain that, or just say a little bit about that, and how does that help us understand maybe both the cosmic evolution of the
Yes.
universe and even maybe the presence of suffering?
Yes, I mean, I love that passage in the Catechism, because it shows that God made us causes and that we're able to act. And you think about Father Lemaitre's discovery with the Big Bang, and that the universe has not always been the way we observe it today. And he talks about the initial beginnings of the universe, how it's so inconceivable. You know, we're trying to understand it with modern
Yes.
physics, and it just acts very differently. But God gave all of the matter and the energy the nature that it could come to where we are now.
Yeah.
And so we can see it's maybe from the secondary causes, you may not see on that level the directedness, but when we look at God's level, we see it's totally directed to human life. He wanted rational creatures, and God's love for us isn't just general, like, oh, I want humans, but he wants us individually and personally.
Wow.
And I think that's important. And Father Lemaitre talks about the Christian researcher is always God's child when he's looking under the microscope, when he's doing any daily activity, and that importance of the personal relationship. And then I think, with suffering, that's a really big question, right? Like, and there's no ultimate answer. The cross is the best that we can come to. But thinking philosophically, if we have contingent beings, then they can actually do stuff. If I'm going to actually be able to do something, I can change things. Well, if I can change things, that means I can cause something to be. I can also cause something to stop. So, I mean, this could be the lunch I'm about to have. You know, I'm nourished. The food disappears. It could be natural disasters, you know, like forest fires or whatever. But then you could think about the new life that comes and the life cycle of a fire of a forest. So whenever there's contingent being that can actually cause stuff, you have that possibility of physical evil, which is aside from moral evil.
Yes. So, well, anyway, thank you so much for that. And maybe just to shift gears a bit to as we kind of begin to kind of work towards our conclusion. Now, you teach high school at the moment, and you're also working with I think it's called Open Light Media, which is a organization for trying to help Thomistic evolution. An understanding of this. Would you want to say a little bit more about the work you're doing?
Certainly. So Open Light Media is the publishing group for my community. Okay. And then Thomistic Evolution is a group I'm also working with, where we're trying to take Catholic principles, Thomistic principles, and how to explain evolution in a Catholic setting. And taking the principles we've been talking about today with primary and secondary causality, and the fact that God sustains us in being and is always involved in what we're doing, but also gives his creation the ability to act and to do stuff. And the fact that the world is in a state of journeying, and taking those principles and helping to communicate them to youth today.
That's great. And is there maybe one last, if you had to kind of summarize, maybe people who maybe are kind of sympathetic with these ideas, but they might have, a high schooler or a college student, what would you say would be maybe either a resource they could look at or the sort of questioning when you get these sorts of questions? How do you try to help people understand them?
I mean, I think the Catechism is always a great place to go, like some of the quotes that we've been talking about. And then Catechism and church documents are always wonderful places to go. But there is a lot of work with our Open Light Media that has a lot of resources. The Dominican friars have a lot of resources online. So there's just so many things electronically now. That's
great. That's great. Again, thanks so much. I want to ask you just 3 quick questions as we finish up our show. First, what's a book you've been reading?
Oh, I've been reading Father Michael Dodd's Unlocking Divine Action, which really takes all of these principles and applies it to the science of today.
So and what was it? So that's Father Michael Dodd's and
Unlocking Divine Action.
I see. So kind of that sense in which God's action is not in competition with ours, but is the very kind of source of our acting. And that's great. And second thing, obviously as a religious sister, I'm sure you have many, practices every day. Maybe what's one practice that you find helps you to, draw closer to God?
Yeah. Well, of course, Eucharistic adoration. We have daily holy hour, so that's certainly. And then in terms of like a shorter one, I love the Anima Christi prayer. So
that is a beautiful one, and that's anyway, it's a great one. I find it's beautiful too. It has that line in there where he says, "Intra tua vulnera absconde me," right? Within your wounds, hide me. Right? It's kind of like, as strange as which, yes, the world is beautiful, and yes, the world is amazing, and the world is filled with suffering. And so when God comes to us, he says, I'm going to make myself vulnerable for you. Vulnerable. That sense, I'm going to make myself woundable for you because I know you are wounded. Yeah. Right. And anyway, it's just such a beautiful prayer. And
I love the image of those wounds being the access to his heart.
Yeah. Wow. That's wonderful. And finally, what's a view or like a belief you held about God that you later discovered, that was kind of false? And what was the truth you discovered?
I think it's kind of what we've been talking about today with not understanding how actively involved, how close God is to me all the time. Like I thought, God's involved in the world and like he can do miracles, but they're kind of like interventions into the world. They're like against the world, but that's not what a miracle is. A miracle, God's causing something without the normal secondary causality. It could be beyond or within the scope of creatures, but he's doing it without his creatures. But that's not contrary to nature because he's the author of nature.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things I learned.
Oh, that's beautifully put. Sister Mary Elizabeth Merriam, thank you so much for being on our show. For people who are interested in the Open Light Media,
they can go to our website, openlightmedia.com, and they can search for evolution there, and they'll find the Thomistic Evolution site.
Well, excellent. And thank you for all your work. Thank you so much for your witness and for your prayers and all your teaching. And thanks so much for being with us on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for this podcast. If you like this episode, please rate and review it on your favorite podcast app to help others find the show. And if you want to take the next step, please consider joining our Annunciation Circle so we can continue to bring you more free content. We'll see you next time on the Catholic Theology Show.